afternoon. I am Kathy Giles-Diaz, and on behalf of the State Department's Media Hub in Brussels, I'd like to welcome participants to today's interactive virtual press briefing. Today, we will be speaking with Ambassador Kurt Volker, the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. Before I turn it over to Ambassador Volker for opening remarks, I would like to make a few comments on procedures for questions. You can start submitting your questions by clicking on the Questions tab and typing in the box that says Type Your Question. Please feel free to leave questions in English, Russian, or French, and we will translate as necessary. If you see a colleague ask a question you'd also like us to answer, you can upvote it by clicking the Like button to the right of that question. We will try to get to as many questions as possible in the limited time that we have, which is approximately 30 minutes. So show your support for the questions you most like us to cover. You can also submit questions or notify us of technical difficulties by emailing thebrussels.hub@state.gov. Again, that is thebrussels.hub@state.gov. With that, we'll get started. Ambassador Volker, thank you for being here today. I'll turn it over to you for an opening statement.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Kathy. It's great to be here. And I think the key things to remind people about are some of the context here. There is an ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine. There are violence occurring every night. There's mortar fire, there's sniper fire, artillery. And so this just has to stop. And we have been engaged. France and Germany have been engaged. Ukraine has been implementing its share of the Minsk agreements. But we've frankly seen no serious movement toward a ceasefire from Russia, no withdrawal of heavy weapons, no removal of foreign fighters, no dismantling of the illegal armed groups that are there. So this conflict just continues to go on. What we want to see, the U.S. position is, and frankly what everyone wants to see, we want to see peace. We want to see security for the population that lives there. We want to see access for humanitarian assistance because the people there are really taking it on the chin. It's a really difficult situation for those people who are living through this conflict. The ability to people to return home. And with that, you would be able to then see the implementation of the Minsk agreements. And that means local elections, a special status for eastern Ukraine within Ukraine under its own constitution, amnesty for people who committed crimes as part of the conflict, not all crimes, but for those that are part of the conflict, and local elections that would then give the opportunity to the people that are there to choose who their legitimate leaders will be in the legitimate local entities. You remember last month in November there were elections, but they were in a controlled environment, an occupied environment. They were for the two people's republics that Russia created there, which don't have any legitimacy within Ukraine or under the Constitution or even with the local population. And it was hardly a free and fair vote. So we'd like to see genuine local elections. And that would then allow the restoration of the territory to Ukrainian sovereignty at the end of all that. So that's what we're there for: humanitarian assistance, peace and security, implementation of Minsk, and restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity. Now that is the objectives that we have. We've had a number of exchanges with Russia over a year now. Over the summer and early autumn, I exchanged some correspondence with my Russian counterpart to see if they were anywhere closer to being willing to come to an agreement. The answer is no, they're not. Russia is still denying its responsibility and denying its involvement in eastern Ukraine. I did offer to go visit Moscow this month, and I was prepared to organize that trip when Russia, separately from this, attacked the Ukrainian Navy in the Black Sea, boarded the vessels, imprisoned the sailors. And as you know, President Trump canceled his meeting with President Putin as a result of that attack and the failure to release the sailors up to this day. And likewise, I'm not in a position then to go to Moscow for the Minsk purposes at a time when Russia is now holding these Ukrainian sailors. If I could just talk a little bit more about that incident, then we'll open up to questions. The attack on the Ukrainian Navy is actually very serious because this is connected to a couple of things. One of them is a unilateral Russian claim of control over the Kerch Straits, which controls access to and from the Sea of Azov. So previously, we all know that Russia has claimed to have annexed Crimea, a claim that no one else accepts. Then they claim the territorial waters around Crimea as also being Russian. And then with that, they're now claiming that the entire Kerch Strait is under unilateral Russian control, which violates their bilateral agreement with Ukraine from 2003, and it allows Russia then to create a choke point for access to and from. Ukraine tried to sail naval ships from its port in Odessa to its port in Mariupol through its own waters. Russia blocked that. When the ships turned around, they were fired upon, and they were actually fired upon in international waters and boarded and taken prisoner there. So there are legal issues we disagree with Russia on over the Kerch Strait itself and the freedom of navigation in and out of the Sea of Azov and access to these Ukrainian ports. And then there's also the illegal actions by the Russian Coast Guard to attack these vessels in open waters and pursue them and imprison them. And now they're charging the sailors under a civil code in Russia, which again is contradictory to all of the international arrangements where a foreign military force acting in its official capacity should not be subject to that, but under some kind of laws of war. And technically, these would be prisoners of war if that's the way Russia wanted to pursue it. So there are a lot of things that are wrong with this. The significance, however, is that this is a new escalation by Russia in its conflict against Ukraine. And it is done openly by Russia. It's not hiding behind proxies in the Donbass this time. It's doing it openly. And it's something that I think everyone in Europe is deeply concerned about. That's why I'm in Brussels today. I wanted to have meetings with EU counterparts. I'll be meeting with the Belgians bilaterally. Also had some meetings at NATO to hear from our friends and our allies what their thoughts are, how they view the most recent incidents and what recommendations they have for moving forward. So I'm taking that on board. And I just have to say that already today in the meetings that I've had, this is an incident that clearly has raised serious concerns across Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now start the question and answer portion of today's discussion. We have an advanced question submitted by Mochil Injov from Club Z Media Group in Bulgaria. And he asks, President Radev has said that Europe must not become hostage to Ukraine's internal politics and ambitions. What is your comment on this statement in the context of the disagreements among EU member states regarding actions against Russia?
Well, I don't think anybody should be hostage to Ukraine's internal politics and ambitions. That's, they have a very robust and vibrant democracy, and they have a lot of people running for president now, and that's going to be a lot of jostling. But what we're talking about today has nothing to do with Ukrainian internal politics. This is about Russia's aggression against Ukraine, Ukraine's right to self-defense, trying to reestablish peace in the Donbass, and trying to deter Russia from any further aggressive acts. This is not part of Ukrainian domestic politics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, our next question comes to us from Konstantin Voselkevich from 2000 Weekly newspaper in Ukraine, and he asks, do you have any encouraging news on the fate of the Ukrainian crew members detained near the Kerch Strait? Will they be released and returned home at any time soon? What is your forecast?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have good news to report there. Many people, including in the United States, including Chancellor Merkel in Germany, including others around the continent, have urged Russia to release these sailors immediately. And Chancellor Merkel raised this on the telephone with President Putin just last week. The fact, however, is that Russia has said no, that they claim that there is some legal process, which is by definition not so, because they're detaining them illegally. But they're claiming a process that will take months for them to go through. So unfortunately, it is not looking good. However, I guess the one piece of good news is that Ukrainians can be assured that everyone, whether it's the United States or EU or NATO or Western Europe, everyone is urging Russia to release these sailors immediately. And I certainly would hope that Russia would do so as a gesture before Christmas. But there's no indication from Russia at this point that they're doing that.
Okay. Our next question comes to us from Patrick Oksan in Mitt Media News Group in Sweden, who asks, what more must the West do to strengthen deterrence so Russia will not fuel more aggression against Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple things. I think the sanctions regime, I believe, does have an impact on Russia. And I think if we are showing that we are reacting when Russia does something, such as it just did, so additional sanctions, that would be an indicator to Russia that future acts would also be met with sanctions. And so I think that could add some deterrent effect there. I also think that keeping a multinational visible presence in and around Ukraine, whether it's in the Black Sea or in parts of Ukraine that are relatively safe, could be an additional step because it would raise the visibility of Russia's actions compared to what we now see.
Okay. We now have a question from the Diplomat magazine in the Netherlands, and they ask, 1 month ago at the Halifax International Security Forum, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Klimkin referred to the discussions between the U.S. and Ukraine on the potential supply of new lethal weapons to Kiev. How are such discussions evolving in light of the Kerch Strait incident?
Right. So what Foreign Minister Klimkin was referring to is the ability of the United States to provide foreign military financing or foreign military sales to Ukraine, something that we are perfectly willing to do, as we do with many other countries. We had, the day before Halifax, we had the U.S.-Ukraine Strategic Partnership Commission. That's a sort of full spectrum across the government consultation, and that includes Defense Department, and we have both Ukrainian national security experts and American national security experts sitting down to talk about Ukraine's national security strategy, its defense capabilities, any gaps that are there, and how we can act to fill those gaps. So we have online, moving through the Congress, is a foreign military financing package of about $250 million, and we have the ability to sell additional equipment. There will be some announcements, notifications to Congress coming up in the next couple of months about some first tranches of that. And this is something that's just going to be ongoing as we look at what Ukraine's needs are and how we can provide some assistance.
All right. Our next question comes to us from AFP, and they ask, do you think there is a possibility that economic sanctions against Russia will be extended over the Azov Sea clash? And what do you think about the Ukrainian call to ban Russian ships from entering European ports? Is that possible?
Yes. So as part of the discussions I had with European Union colleagues earlier today, is we have a basket of sanctions in place that relate to Crimea. We have a basket that is there relating to Russia's failure to implement the Minsk agreements. And we talked about, well, what should be done with the Sea of Azov. I think the debate will be in Europe over whether this is a third basket or whether this is connected to Crimea. But the notion that there needs to be a response and some additional sanctions or listing of names would occur seems to be one that's gaining some traction, and I would not be surprised at all to see that happen in the next month or two.
Okay. Our next question comes to us from Interfax, and they ask, the rebels in Donetsk recently said that Ukraine may be preparing a military offensive in the Donetsk region. They also expect the Ukrainian side to stage provocations in Mariupol in order to prolong the martial law. Do you consider these assertions plausible?
Well, I think these assertions are made by pro-Russian entities in order to deflect attention away from what Russia's doing. So Russia, as we know, it is claimed to control now the entire Kerch Strait. It is controlling access in and out. It is restricting the freedom of movement of vessels beyond what's necessary just for the safe passage. And it has then attacked these Ukrainian Navy ships. So I think that's what Russia is up to. And so as a deflection, they refer to, oh, Ukraine is planning attacks or Ukraine is provoking, when in fact this is what's been going on. I think it's actually remarkable that Ukraine has been as restrained as it has. And you look at the Ukrainian Navy, for instance, even being fired upon in the Black Sea, did not fire back and create a firefight with Russia. And I think that showed tremendous restraint under the circumstances. And I don't foresee that you're going to be seeing Ukrainian attacks, but these assertions may be ways of creating some cover for possible Russian attacks, which I hope don't occur, but I have to say it's possible.
Okay. We will now turn to a question from Yaroslav Dogopol from Ukraine Forum in Ukraine, who says, what actions does the United States consider in order to respond to ongoing Russian aggression and deter further escalation?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is my very visit here today is because we want to talk with our friends in Europe, our allies, France, Germany, UK, others, to make sure that we have a well-coordinated Western response, Western position on this. It's not in Ukraine's interest or anyone's interest to bilateralize a response to Russia's attack on Ukraine into a U.S.-Russia dynamic. So we're trying to make sure that we're well coordinated with our European allies and partners. Within that, then, I think we have to look at the basket of sanctions. We should look at the basket of monitoring or some kind of deployment, for instance, of a ship visit or two to the Black Sea to show presence. The British are having a ship visit today and tomorrow, and I believe it's a very senior member of their government will be in Odessa. We have other visitors going to Ukraine as well. So there's a lot that I think that can be done to show an increased engagement and what I would hope would be preventive action to dissuade Russia from any further aggression.
We now have an advanced question from Stephanie Lichtenstein, who is with Wiener Zeitung and the Security and Human Rights Monitor in Austria. And she asks, are there plans to extend the OSCE SMM, a special monitoring mission, to the Azov Sea area? What has been discussed and decided at the last Normandy format meeting on the 11th of December?
Sure. So there's two questions. On the Normandy meeting, it did take place. It was at the level of diplomatic advisors to the presidents or chancellors. It didn't really agree or decide anything other than that they need to keep talking, which of course everyone was willing to talk. But it did not result in the release of the sailors. It did not result in a ceasefire. It did not result in the winter package of humanitarian assistance moving forward. So very disappointing meeting, in fact, that Russia's really not willing to move on anything. Also, they talk about the prospect of a UN peacekeeping mission in eastern Ukraine to replace the Russian forces, and Russia, again, doesn't really engage in that. As for the SMM, the monitoring mission under the OSCE, their mandate already says that they have the authority to operate throughout Ukraine, and that could, in theory, also include Ukrainian territorial waters. The issue, however, is they don't have the capacity to do that, so it would require additional capacity for them to do so. And then the other issue is that, of course, Russia is now acting in its own name here, unlike in the Donbass, where it is pretending it is not involved in pushing these proxy entities forward. In the case of the Sea of Azov, the Kerch Strait, Russia is doing this overtly in its own name. And so it's very unlikely to have the SMM in a position where it would be overseeing or monitoring Russia's own activities. Russia, which has a say over this in the OSCE along with all the others, because it's a consensus organization, would try to block that.
All right, our next question comes to us from BBC Turkish Service, and they ask, considering Turkey's geographic situation, does the United States expect any support from its NATO ally against Russia, technical or logistical support? And what does the U.S.'s stance on Turkey's offer to mediate talks between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, I think it's good for people to engage diplomatically with all sides, to talk with Ukrainians, understand what they're going through, understand what their needs are. If people have influence with Putin, they should try to use that influence to try to end the war. And so I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The issue, however, has never been a lack of channels of communication with Russia or Ukraine. The issue has been Russia's unwillingness to end the war. So if we can have some impact on that, that would be the best possible thing. As far as the Black Sea goes, Turkey plays a critically important role. It has the longest Black Sea coastline. It has the straits going in and out. So it is critically important as an ally in that region. We want to be respectful of Turkey's obligations under the Montreux Convention, as Turkey is itself. We also want to work with Turkey on security in the Black Sea and on freedom of navigation. That said, I think that there are things that we should now be looking at that maybe we weren't looking at before to increase presence in the Black Sea, whether on a bilateral basis or under any EU auspices. I think there is some kind of NATO exercise planned. So I think we ought to be thinking about how that can ramp up a bit, but we are very respectful of Turkey's obligations there as well.
All right, our next question is from Club Radio in Hungary, and they ask, Ambassador Kornstein was critical about the Hungarian attitude toward Ukraine at the Committee on Foreign Relations in the Parliament. What tools do you have to keep the Orban government under pressure not to block Ukraine's partnership with NATO?
Well, Hungary is blocking Ukraine's relationship with NATO at the moment, and we think that's very unfortunate. Here you have a country that has been attacked by Russia. Russia has seized Ukrainian territory. The fighting is still going on every day in the Donbass, and they are seeking partnership and coordination and cooperation with NATO. And we are unable to schedule a ministerial level meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Commission because Hungary blocks it. So those are just the facts, and that's very unfortunate. There is an issue that Hungary has raised, which is respect for rights of national minorities, Hungarian minority in Ukraine. This is a legitimate issue to raise, and it's an issue that affects minorities all over Europe. You have Russian speakers in the Baltic states, you have Germans in South Tyrol and Italy, or Austrian South Tyrol and Italy, and so forth. So there are lots of national minority issues around. These are things that deserve serious attention. Ukraine has passed a law that requires these minorities also to learn Ukrainian. That's a reasonable thing for people to learn the national language where they live. Hungary is insisting that they also be able to continue to study in Hungarian. That's also a reasonable thing. National minorities ought to be able to study in their own language. And this is something that can eminently be worked out bilaterally between Ukraine and Hungary based on European principles that are well established in other places. So I think this is an issue, but I think it's a very solvable issue, and it is inappropriate and missing the forest for the trees, if you will, to hold Ukraine's relationship with NATO hostage over the bilateral sorting out of these minority rights, which is a legitimate issue, but it shouldn't stop our ability to work with Ukraine, including at a ministerial level at NATO.
All right. We now have a question from Yulia Didenko with Donbass Public TV, and she asks, do you have information about the exchange of prisoners in the Donbass? The last big exchange took place almost a year ago. Mm-hmm. Why do you think there has been no progress on this issue?
Well, I was very happy to see the exchange that took place a year ago. I think that was an important step. We hoped that it would have built some confidence. In the end, it didn't. Ukraine, I know, remains ready to engage in further prisoner exchange. And President Poroshenko has been trying to call President Putin to talk about that. And Russia at the moment is not interested in prisoner exchanges. I think they're even holding these sailors, which are even outside of that framework. They're holding the Ukrainian Navy sailors now for a few months. And I think this is a desire of Russia to try to use them as hostages or pawns in putting political pressure on the government in Kiev. Which is unfortunate because these are real people with real families, and there's a willingness on the Ukrainian side to make an exchange, and I would hope that it would be done.
We now have a question from Daniel McLaughlin with the Irish Times, who asks, President Poroshenko has talked about a major buildup of Russian troops and armor close to the Ukraine's borders. Can the United States confirm that this buildup has taken place? And if so, are those Russian forces still in place?
Yes, that is all true. It's not something that has happened in the last week or two, however. This is something that's happened over a period of years. So Russia invaded Ukraine, it took Crimea, it is occupying the Donbass, and it has within Russia built up significant military capacity, and also in Crimea built up significant military capacity over time. So it is much larger than was there before all of the conflict started, and it is still the case.
All right, we have a question now from Francesco Beccis, who is with Formici.net in Italy, and they ask, Mr. Ambassador, despite the odds, the Italian government voted for EU sanctions against Russia. Is this a move towards European unity in respect to the Minsk agreements?
I would say yes, it is. I think that You have, first off, an Italian government which has publicly said they would like to be able to lift sanctions on Russia. They want to encourage trade and they want to support small and medium businesses in Italy. And yet, I think they are recognizing that the circumstances for which these sanctions were originally put in place have not changed. Russia is still occupying Donbass. Russia is still claiming to have annexed Crimea. It is still fighting. And then on top of that, it has done new things. There was the Skripal attack in the UK. There was this attack just a couple weeks ago in the Black Sea. So I think any reasonable government, including the Italian government, is going to look at this and say, we can't do this now. So they're joining the EU consensus to keep these sanctions in place.
All right, I think that's probably all the questions that we have time for. Okay. Did you have some closing words you'd like to offer?
No, thanks. I think that does it. I hope that it was very useful for your journalists. Thank you at the Hub for organizing this. Again, our interest here is to see peace restored for the people of Ukraine in the Donbass and around. And it's unfortunate that we now find ourselves yet again at a point of possible escalation.
All right, thank you. And thank you to all of you for your questions, and thank you to Ambassador Volker for joining us today. To the participants who joined us today, we will send links to broadcast quality files momentarily to everyone that registered for the call through Eventbrite. You can use these to clip audio or video from today's program. We will also provide a transcript as soon as it is available. If you didn't register through Eventbrite and want to receive the files, please fill out the short survey by clicking on the Polls tab at the top of the event page. Thank you again for your participation, and we hope that you can join us for another press briefing soon. Goodbye.